Kaimere is a distant planet. It is defined by waves of life brought from Earth and set free to evolve independently in this new context. The indigenous life of the planet, swarms of microbes called magic by the people who live there, are what harvest Earth organisms and make copies on Kaimere. As the asteroid which concluded the Mesozoic never struck Kaimere, dinosaurs remain the dominant terrestrial megafauna.
Trilobites have a long history in Kaimere. As one of the first animals harvested from Earth to go find widespread success in Kaimere, they already have a great claim as one of this planet's first great pioneers. Unlike their earthly ancestors, they have survived to modern times, and while many lineages have died off, they remain a highly diverse and successful group of animals. However, their exploration and success was not limited to the sea, as it seems their ancestors of Earth were restricted to. When the riverways and shallow seas were clogged with a rot of algal and magical blooms as a consequence of the terraforming of Kaimere, a few trilobites found an unexpected refuge: life on land. These first explorers were not terrestrial. Instead, they seem to have been from a species either adapted to fresh water, or, more likely, were tidal explorers that increasingly got used to being trapped on land. While they almost certainly had an inclination to land prior to this cataclysm, they would have returned to water to breathe once if not several times per day, and some water would be necessary for their reproduction. But their first steps would start them on a path of adaptation that would see them thrive. Indeed, in a fairly short period of time, these pioneers found great success in the expansive, humid jungles taking over the planet. Yes, riverways would be impossible to live in at this time, but it was still a rainy climate and they would have gotten all the water they would need in the air and in pockets of fresh water that appeared with their near-constant storms. It seems that, during the worst of these blooms, terrestrial trilobites outnumbered their ocean-bound kin. This would not last once the oceans recovered and trilobites of the seaways rebounded, but this moment is still a surprising testament to the evolutionary innovation. Trilobites of Earth never seem to have adapted to life on land. While there may have been many reasons for this, with luck and random chance perhaps playing a bigger role than you might expect, there was a fairly substantial anatomical hurdle these trilobites had to clear before they could survive on land: the position of their gills. Arthropods evolved in the water. 4 clades of terrestrial arthropods, the groups containing scorpions, millipedes, and pancrustacea containing both insects and woodlice, each evolved from aquatic ancestors. These 4 lineages independently became terrestrial. They do not share a common terrestrial ancestor. In many of these lineages, their lungs or other respiratory apparatuses are modified from gills. Each accomplished this from quite different parts of the body, but fundamentally it seems to have been a generally similar process. Woodlice, with at least one desert-adapted exception, must keep their lungs damp, as even though they are presumed to have evolved back in the Carboniferous, their lungs are still exposed and quite basal, compared to the gills of other crustaceans, which, it must be said, can often breathe in the air for hours or even days if their gills are kept damp. Insects and millipedes have similar gas exchange models to one another, using numerous tubes throughout their bodies to draw in fresh air and distribute oxygen to their tissues. Though it might be tempting to think that a similar respiratory system of insects and millipedes might suggest a close relationship, this appears to have been an independent evolution, as insects are generally recovered within pancrustacea. The configuration of most arachnid lungs is similar to their aquatic ancestors and to crustaceans, though theirs are encased, save for a single air opening, thereby better controlling the air quality coming in and out. Trilobites are outside the main arthropod clade surviving today. They are often recovered as belonging to the same branch of the arthropod tree as scorpions and spiders, though not particularly close. And some phylogenies do find them in other places in the tree. Their gills, however, stem directly from the legs rather than aft of the limbs as in the ancestor of arachnids. These gills grow from the leg base, or coxa. The gill's support structure, or exopod, grows up, while the endopod, or leg, grows down. In aquatic trilobites, this appears to have been a very efficient system. Legs were powered by oxygenated water churning from their own motion. This exposure wasn't ideal for terrestrial trilobites. Woodlice can trap moisture under their bodies, though this wasn't as plausible for the trilobite configuration. Damp air in this hot, rainy world might have been the key to the gills in these first pioneers not drying out. This was just for their transition, though. Based on some albeit poorly preserved First Dynasty specimens, it seems they fairly quickly began to adapt and specialize into this terrestrial world. Their gills never fully decoupled from their legs, though the coxa that supported both respirative and locomotive appendages seems to have become short and fairly broad to maximize flexibility quite early on. While the leg remained more or less the same, the exopod supporting the gills folded in on itself along the outer edge, forming a J in cross-section. This outer edge grew long and flat, resting along the back edge of either its cephalon, the same pleura, or along one of the segments behind it. This meant that the only opening was along the bend in the endopod, which opens or closes slightly as the trilobite walks, so still efficiently draws in fresh air with each step. They can also be exposed when the trilobite is at rest. This configuration allows these trilobites to keep their gills generally moist in these new chambers, imperative to their transition to land. It seems for much of the First Dynasty, these terrestrial trilobites were likely technically amphibious, still requiring water now and then, and relied upon water for reproduction. As the planet became steadily more arid, lineages that required less and less water would eventually become increasingly successful. By the end of the First Dynasty, many terrestrial trilobites truly lived up to the name, and became a majority following the asteroid impact that ended the era and was heralded to the Permian Dynasty. Throughout the Permian Dynasty, terrestrial trilobites continued to thrive. They never got especially large or diverse, being generalist scavengers and hunters of small invertebrates, but they were quite common, being found in most formations of the era. The Mesozoic dynasties were a similar story. Being small burrowers, they were able to endure the worst of the ice ages far better than a lot of other fauna. While they competed with any number of woodlice, insects, worms, and other small invertebrates, the diversity we see in this niche on Earth today means that it should come as no surprise that this clade found their way just fine. While the dynastic extinction appears to have hit them very hard throughout the known world, some survived and still diversified, while others were later introduced from Kyrule via drifting mats of vegetation, or the southern islands on Arvel as they converged upon Nikar. In the known world today, there are around 30 genera and between 90 and nearly 1,000 species, depending on which researcher you ask. Most abundant in Kedan, and therefore familiar to the assembly, is the abedril. This inch-long trilobite is, like most of its kind, a generalist detritivore, feeding on just about anything it can process on the forest floor. It is typical for them to be found under fallen logs, or really anywhere with ample damp soil. Amzen, or Rooster Crest Island where the assembly resides, has its own endemic species, or perhaps subspecies of trilobite, the Agathonosian abedril. Like its Kedaneth cousin, the Agathonosian abedril is abundant, found in the forests throughout the island. They are a common symbol of the island, being one of the few endemic fauna found nowhere else in Kaimere. Part of the disparity in the number of trilobite species is that there are dozens of large islands and thousands of small ones throughout the Kaline Sea, and many have isolated populations of trilobites and other microfauna that qualify as species under some designations, given that many are, like the Agathonosian abedril, isolated populations and have been for over 1,000,000 years, despite looking and behaving very similar to kin on other islands and continents. The copperbug is a trilobite found in Picardia. Many aquatic arthropods mineralize their shells with calcium carbonate. This is harder for terrestrial arthropods to do, though some manage. The Picardian genus Hoplochocus is one such trilobite, doing so to an extreme degree. They molt in the Gulf of Iritame and collect so much calcium carbonate at this time that their shells develop a hard, copper-like exterior. Once rolled up, they are said to be hard as metal. Arvel is home to the most species of terrestrial trilobite in the known world. Between the swamps, gardens, and dense jungles, there is an abundant habitat for this clay to reside. One family, the arbivorids, have adapted to eat wood. They usually don't consume living trees, instead processing dead wood. Indeed, they are among the most prolific feeders of dead trees in some areas, arguably considered the most successful herbivores in some regions. This family has spread to most regions of the known world thanks to this habit. They are certainly most abundant and speciose in Arvel, where they seem to have originated. They won't eat treated wood, instead favoring damp, rotting lumber, so are generally not considered a pest as long as construction is made of quality, well-prepared lumber. If a house or other structure is in disrepair, arbivorids can quickly become a serious problem. They, along with conifer mites and termites, are often cited as a reason why a lot of peoples who live in regions like Picardia that get heavy rainfall to burn down their houses every century or so and build anew to ensure that their lumber is both structurally sound and not a temptation for these and other ever most helpful little creatures. The fire beetle is the only terrestrial trilobite found in the Hausi Prairie. They are capable of enduring a prolonged stasis, which they employ after rolling up as a fire passes by. They can remain like this for several days before awakening. Some still perish, but a combination of this stasis and their fire-resistant carapace means they are often quite capable of rebounding after a fire. Indeed, they often thrive in its aftermath, as burned Hausi grass is quite easy for them to digest. Kaimere's largest terrestrial trilobite is found in the rainforests of southeastern Nikar, the tablet bug. They can reach 8 inches in their largest known specimens, though most adults are about half this length. Little is known of their behavior, as this is a poorly studied region, though their basal anatomy suggests that they likely are generalist scavengers that take in an occasional invertebrate. Their size has been proposed to be a product of this being an extremely humid environment, with near constant showers hammering the coast, though again, this is merely conjecture. There have been trilobites reported in surveys of the realms beyond the known world. It appears that they have cosmopolitan distribution, even being found on recent volcanic islands in the middle of oceans. Small detritivores are perfect for surviving oceanic crossings on mats of floating vegetation, so it should come as no surprise that they have found such widespread success. Though trilobites never conquered the land in Earth's history, their success in Kaimere explores a possible way that this may have occurred in our own history if circumstances had been different. They may not be large or generally attract much interest from the people who live near them, but they are still a common feature in the staggeringly abundant and diverse cast of microfauna living throughout the known world and beyond. Cheers to Siren Lord for sponsoring this episode. Along with a passion for trilobites, this sponsor is also a fellow author. His first fantasy novel, The Saga of Myria, came out in 2023, and the sequel, The Western Voyage, is set to be released later this year. As with my other Trilobite episodes this year, I owe great thanks to the Museum of the Earth. Their specimens for reference and staff for questions was an invaluable resource. The Museum of the Earth is facing hard times and has had to downsize a lot of the aspects of their operations in order to compensate. Direct donations go a long way in keeping priceless educational organizations like this one going. I've seen a change.org site going around, and while the awareness is good, donations to that only spread the word, they don't actually fund the museum. I've included a link here and in the description of the video if you want to more directly contribute to the museum. Thanks again to the Siren Lord, to my new and most generous Patreon patrons for your support, and thank you for watching. Cheers, folks!